the DPRK has, had for a few years now, has as its official position that they're not going to engage in any form of dialogue with anyone that is based on the premise that they are the only ones that need to denuclearize. The way that
Mm.
they view it, they have a perfectly legal and rational nuclear weapons program. And, like, this is not a question of like how anyone else in the world feels about it. I'm just explaining, like, the way that they define it in their own laws, right? And so, with the way that things are today, it would be illegal under DPRK law for them to have negotiations about this with the foreign power. So they're
Mm.
not going to do it, right? But somehow that seems to not really register when it comes to any kind of media conversation, any kind of state or government conversation when it comes to the DPRK, anywhere basically except the Korean Peninsula itself.
We are going to head to our interview with Ju-Hyun Park, activist with Nodutdol and director of engagement at Breakthrough News. We recorded it just an hour back. Ju-Hyun is in Seoul, South Korea, so time difference is challenging at this moment. So let's head to that interview right now. The Korean Peninsula has been dominating international headlines after US President Donald Trump announced on Truth Social this week that he had directed the Department of War to significantly reduce the annual Ulchi Freedom Shield joint military exercises between the US and South Korea, citing his very good relationship with Kim Jong Un. The announcement shocked many and drove a flurry of speculations about the motivations behind the decision, as well as reviving liberal memes and discourse about a deep bond between two strongman leaders. While some have speculated that this is merely a symptom of the US empire stretched too thin as it struggles to finish off the war in Iran, others have hypothesized that the US and North Korea may be going back to talks. To break down this news and what is really behind Trump's announcement, we are joined from Seoul by Ju-Hyun Park, organizer with Nodutdol and director of engagement at Breakthrough News. Ju-Hyun, thank you so much for joining us.
Zoe, great to be here. Thanks for that intro. Rania, great to be on the show.
Great. Well, let's start off with what just happened. So, what do you make of Trump's announcement? Is it the US pulling back from its military presence and activities in Korea because of Trump's good relationship with Kim Jong Un, or is there something else that's at play here?
Zoe, I'm going to be really blunt with you. I think that the way that Western corporate media focuses on the interpersonal dynamics between Trump and Kim is actually just a way to deceive everyone and continue to obfuscate the reality in Korea, because despite the fact that this is a country that the US has technically been at war with since 1950, it's actually a place that pretty much no one in the US political class, the media, or of course the general society know basically anything about. I think to just answer the question directly, we can actually go back to 2024 during the presidential election when Trump was really playing up his supposed personal bond with Kim Jong Un, and there was an official response from the DPRK, which didn't really reject that the two of them might get along, but did clarify how they see the issue, and they said pretty directly, the foreign policy of a state and personal feelings must be strictly distinguished. I don't know how much more plain we can make it than that. The corporate media is treating this as entertainment, as if it's a gossip, but that's not how the DPRK sees it. They don't see it as an interpersonal relationship. They see it as a state-to-state relationship because that is what it is. It is a relationship between two governments based on their interests. And so we have to ask them, well, what are Trump's interests? What are the interests of the United States when it comes to Korea? And why would they pull back at this time? And the clearest answer is the Iran war. It's because the US is facing a shortage of surface to surface missiles, missile interceptors. They just had to pull their last aircraft carrier out of the Pacific because those sailors aboard the Abraham Lincoln are literally jumping off the ship because of the dire conditions on board, since they've been deployed for so long. They cannot afford to do Ulchi Freedom Shield in the way it was initially planned. That's why this announcement is coming so last minute. I think when we look at that situation, we can conclude that this has nothing to do with a concerted effort to reestablish dialogue with the DPRK in any kind of serious way, because if that were the case, they had months to cancel this. And why only cancel it in part? when they could just, get rid of the entire thing, which would make way more sense. So I think, we're just dealing with another situation where the Trump administration is improvising. They're trying to really just score as many political points as they can and, cover up their own mistakes in the process. And, we have a media that's just frankly going along with it because apparently, even though it's 2026 and we've been dealing with this guy for more than a decade, that's still what the media in the United States does.
Yeah, well, what can you expect from a corporate warmongering, simplistic media? But that's why we're here, to explain to people what's actually happening. And so I appreciate that breakdown. And, South Korea's disgraced and ousted President Yoon Suk-yeol had a hardline approach with regards to relations with North Korea, adopting this hostile and militarist approach and really embracing U.S.-led military alliance, which sought to isolate and enrich both the DPRK and China. Sorry, encircle, not enrich. Isolate and enrich. No, to isolate and encircle both the DPRK and China. And then Democratic Party leader and current president Lee Jae-Myung has sought to tone down this rhetoric and simultaneously has been slightly less eager about following all of Washington's dictates. So you argue in your article for BT that Trump's announcement also comes as a consequence of Seoul pushing back on some of Washington's demands. Ju-Hyun, can you elaborate on this tension between Washington and Seoul? And is this good news for rapprochement on the peninsula, or is that still a ways to go?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, Rania, and I'm glad you're raising it. I think one thing I would say is that I don't know if we can really use the term push back so much as avoid. I was talking about what is going on between Lee Jae-Myung and Trump with some friends in Seoul here, actually just today. And we settled on that the best analogy is when someone keeps asking you to get coffee and you keep telling them you will, and then you never follow up. That's basically what's been happening between Lee Jae-Myung and Trump. Trump is like, when are you going to invest the $350 billion into the US? And Lee Jae-Myung is like, we're working on it. And then the investments don't come. And then Trump is saying, well, when are you going to deploy naval units to Hormuz? And Lee Jae-Myung is like, oh, we're very seriously considering that. And they have been seriously considering it for the last 6 months. And, just this week, after all of this, they're coming back out and saying, hey, we want you to know we're considering that. Right. But then the answer just seems to never come. Right. So I think what that demonstrates is a good deal of political pragmatism. They're trying to avoid the highest risk things that Trump is trying to demand. At the same time, Lee Jae-Myung is not actually effectively preventing the South Korea from becoming further embedded into the overall kind of architecture of US imperialism that Trump is trying to pivot towards. I mean, he was just at the NATO conference in Turkey, and his big pitch there was that he thinks that there should be more collaboration between South Korean weapons companies and the European defense industry. South Korea just participated in RIMPAC in Hawaii, the largest naval exercises anywhere in the world. More than 30 nations, including the so-called state of Israel, participating this year. And South Korea was given the naval command post. That's not just like some token placement. That is a indication of the fact that the US is really relying on South Korea as a military proxy in the region. And so, I think that what is happening politically is interesting. It can even be entertaining. Perhaps there are inklings of things that can come further down the road, but I don't think it necessarily means that we are about to see a breakthrough on the Korean Peninsula. And that's actually where I would really strongly caution the left, because I do think that there is a tendency to not always understand the complexities at play here on the peninsula, and to just assume that anytime something goes down and it seems like there's some tension, that means that the US is about to pull out, reunification is imminent, etc. The US occupation has been here for almost a century. It is going to take much longer time than just the events of 1 week to undo everything that's been done here. And relations between the North and South are actually at their worst, arguably, since the armistice. And so, this is a very thorny puzzle. It's going to take a long time to unravel. And, I think that the tension of the world in this moment is a good indication that it's time for all of us to just get more familiar with the issue, because this is something that actually affects us all.
Well, we're so lucky to have you break it down for us because of that. Because again, as you said, there's a lot more at play here than corporate media will be willing to tell us. And you wrote a great article, which people can find on Breakthrough News, talking about this announcement. And in this article, you detailed how the suspension of Ulchi Freedom Shield in the past had been central to dialogue. But today, it seems that this overture of reducing the exercises will unlikely be enough to bridge the divide that currently exists. Can you explain why that is and how the nuclear question has actually become more of a central issue as a starter for dialogue? And in your opinion, has the Iran war impacted the DPRK's calculations on this issue? Given, and many would argue that it was precisely Iran's lack of a nuclear weapons program that perhaps gave the United States and Israel the confidence it needed to launch the war in the first place.
Yeah, Zoe, before I get into that, I just really want to credit really stalwart person I spoke to here in South Korea for this article, Jae-Myung, who is the Secretary General of Korean Peace Solidarity for Sovereignty and Reunification. Check out what she has to say in the article. Check out the organization. For everything that I have to say, there's an entire, left movement here in Korea that often is always just teaching me everything. So I just want to just start there. Now, when it comes to the issue of, war games in Korea and the denuclearization question, I think what we need to understand is that the United States is in a position where it really has no one to blame but itself, because the DPRK has engaged the US in multiple rounds of attempted negotiations. They have offered many times to freeze their nuclear program, to be open to the possibility of denuclearizing entirely, based on the U.S. Really meeting quite reasonable conditions, which would have primarily centered around ending the state of constant hostility here on the Korean Peninsula, and this process has been playing out since the early 90s. The U.S. had many opportunities to, kind of go about things as they would have preferred it. And, every single time they just decided to keep pushing and, not be satisfied with what they were able to get. And that's why we're where we are today, which is that the DPRK has, had for a few years now, has as its official position that they're not going to engage in any form of dialogue with anyone that is based on the premise that they are the only ones that need to denuclearize. The way that they view it, they have a perfectly legal and rational nuclear weapons program. And, this is not a question of how anyone else in the world feels about it. I'm just explaining the way that they define it in their own laws, right? And so, with the way that things are today, it would be illegal under DPRK law for them to have negotiations about this with the foreign power, so they're not going to do it, right? But somehow that seems to not really register when it comes to any kind of media conversation, any kind of state or government conversation when it comes to the DPRK, anywhere basically except the Korean Peninsula itself. And so I think that that is something that really needs to be internalized by everyone in terms of what it's actually going to take to even restart talks. The conditions and the framework of the talks have to be entirely reset to make them possible at all. And so to even talk about will talks happen because the US made this small concession or that small concession is in some ways a waste of time, because we know, or it is known rather, what those conditions would need to be, and the US is just plainly not meeting them. Now, when it comes to this question of does the Iran war have anything to do with this? Well, the DPRK actually reached this position, before the most recent aggression on Iran began. That being said, I think that, the DPRK has learned a lot from watching US imperialist wars around the world. I mean, they saw the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of, or rather the war on Libya, even, going all the way back to the invasion of Grenada and, the attacks on Yugoslavia and things like that. That's the context in which the DPRK has developed its defense doctrine, its diplomatic doctrine as well. And so, they're not just responding from nowhere. You know, they're reading world events, they're looking at how the US is behaving on the world stage, and that greatly informs their military and strategic priorities, and that includes their decision to develop a nuclear deterrent. And, you know, I think that we certainly have to say that like it has been quite effective. We also need to understand that like it doesn't necessarily mean that the US isn't going to attempt something. We know from reporting in the New York Times that in 2019, SEAL Team 6 was sent into the DPRK for a mission that, you know, is not fully clear from the reporting that was provided, but we know that they murdered several fishermen who just happened to be around at the wrong place at the wrong time. They quite gruesomely punctured their lungs and then tossed their bodies into the sea so that, you know, their families would never find them, and so that, you know, the presence of US Special Forces would not be detected. And so the DPRK had nuclear weapons at that time, right? And the United States was still willing to do that. And so I think that, you know, like what's going on with Iran has certainly generated a lot of conversation around, you know, what is the place of nuclear proliferation for the global South in this coming century, particularly in this phase when the US is so aggressive. But we also need to understand that this kind of aggression can be reasonably deterred only up to a point, because what is driving it is in fact quite unreasonable, right? We are talking about people that, and really a class in the United States that is driven by a need to dominate the entire world. And I think that even here in Korea, we may come to a point where the deterrence that has been established so far may be quite significantly tested. And I think that, you know, we shouldn't write off the possibility of US aggression in this region.
No, definitely well said. And, you know, I also wanted to ask here as we wrap, Ju-Hyun, North Korea has responded to Trump's announcement by stating, quote, "We regard it as the one unworthy of comment and have no interest in it at all." And added, "We are paying more attention to the fact that the joint military drills between the US and the Republic of Korea have been steadily staged and are still underway." Clearly noting that despite the shortening of one drill, the US military presence on the peninsula remains practically unchanged. For our audience that's perhaps not familiar, can you outline what the US military presence looks like in Korea, its main purpose, and what it's meant for Koreans in both the North and the South?
Yeah, I think the thing to understand is that the Korean War is still ongoing, and it's not just because of a legal technicality, because it's an armistice and not a peace agreement, but the US military is active here every single day. You know, I have been participating in, you know, the last week or so as part of the Taiju Solidarity Brigade, which brought 21 organizations from like the anti-war and like progressive sectors from the United States, from Hawaii, from Guam or Guam, from India and the Philippines. And we visited a lot of sites of US atrocities and struggle against US militarization all over South Korea. And, you know, I've been to some of these places before. I went to some places I had never been before as well. And every single time, Rania, I see and learn new horrific kinds of things, you know, things that are often very difficult to describe. But I think, you know, to just kind of paint a picture, just in terms of figures, you know, the US has access to about 80 military bases in Korea overall. There's 28,000 troops on this peninsula. When you go to the largest US bases, the air is just filled with the sound of F-16s, you know. And, you know, you go to the communities that have been dealing with these bases for decades, there are horrific stories of like hundreds of families being uprooted. You know, in the past few days, I've walked through entire communities that were erased because the bases were expanded. I've looked at like the former grounds of elementary schools that are now just like flat stone foundations with trees growing all around them, places that the US has said that it needs in order to practice bombing. And, you know, I think that there's a tendency in the United States across the political spectrum to just kind of take for granted that the US presence in Korea is some kind of act of largesse, or, you know, some kind of act of generosity that benefits the Korean people. I cannot think of anything more ahistorical, paternalistic, and racist than that, because the US has not protected the Korean people. The US has oppressed the Korean people. The US has killed millions of people on this peninsula during the Korean War. The US has propped up military dictatorships in the South. The US military has poisoned the land. They have raped women. They have engaged in brutal exploitation of local people. US soldiers for decades, and still to this day, were pretty much invulnerable from any kind of legal consequences for any crimes they committed against Koreans. It's a colonial occupation. I think that's the thing that is not understood outside of this context. And so, uh, I think that it's good that we are in a moment where, despite all of the messiness of it, there is an opportunity to talk about the reality here in Korea, because so much of people's understanding of it, quite frankly, is just filtered through, these memes, through these kinds of like humorous takes of, I would argue both the North and the South, that I think is really fundamentally dehumanizing and actually just, kind of tries to give up the responsibility to look at history in its face, look at the present in its face, to attempt to understand the humanity of the Korean people and the realities that we face here as a result of US imperialism. And, I would take this as an opportunity to say that if this is something that you don't know about and you want to, then I urge you to do so. Because as I mentioned before, this is not going to be the final episode where, everything gets neatly wrapped up. This is one more instance in a very long historical process. Tensions will flare up in Korea again. There will be more news coming out of Korea again that will be confusing and difficult to comprehend if you're not familiar with the issues. But I think that just as people around the world have really taken it upon themselves to learn and understand the realities of Palestine, I think that that is something that can also happen for the situation in Korea. And I think that that's our duty as internationalists, that's our duty as anti-imperialists, and I believe in the way that principled people around the world respond to these calls. So,
well, Ju-Hyun Park, organizer with Nodutdol and director of engagement at Breakthrough News, we thank you so much for breaking all of that down for us. And thankfully, you are someone who writes very beautifully and very often. So encourage people to check out their writing, which you can find at breakthroughnews.org. And I think people can also follow some of the work at Nodutdol to become a little more informed on what's happening, especially as it comes into headlines again. So Ju-Hyun, thank you so much for joining us.
thank you, Rania. Thank you, Zoe.